Pit Talk, brought to you by Shannon's.
Cars are our passion. Building, restoring, or modifying. It's about making it our own. It's an obsession. Shannon's know what it's worth. That's why the agreed value includes all your modifications. Get a quote online today.
This is the moment then that we've all been waiting for.
4 in a row, Max.
Here comes Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris.
They are playing hardball out there at the moment.
The pivotal moment of 2024.
Hello and welcome to Pit Talk, brought to you by Shannon's. On this week's episode, Marc Márquez is a world champion again after emotional scenes and his title victory at the Japanese Motorcycle Grand Prix at the weekend. And this weekend, Formula One returns for the Singapore Grand Prix in what could be an important weekend for the championship picture. My name's Michael Laminato. It's great to have your company and the company of my co-host. He's more than a number. It's Matt Clayton.
Michael, good to join you. Good to join everyone on this week's show. And if I'm looking unusually chipper and bright, it's because we've had MotoGP in Australian daylight hours and a World Championship decided. So good times for everyone. Good times for Marc Márquez. Good times for me.
It's great times. It's great times for everyone involved. Just look forward to the Formula One Championship being decided in the sprint in Qatar later this year. Approximately 2 a.m. But that's down the road. We can look forward to that another time. We do want to start with Marc Márquez, obviously. We're between great weekend as well for it in the sense that no other motorsport on. Full focus of the motorsport community on a pretty remarkable occasion at the Japanese Grand Prix in Montego, a circuit important in his career, important in title-deciding history in MotoGP. Perhaps none chapter more important than this one with Marc Márquez getting it done. We could tackle this from any number of angles, but let's talk about his response after that race, which I thought really summed up how important it was to him to get this one finally over the line. Yeah,
look, this is not... Look, being a seven-time MotoGP world champion, it's an incredible achievement in and of itself, but the journey for him to get 6 to 7... He won 6 titles in his first 7 years in MotoGP. He won the title as a 20-year-old rookie, the youngest world champion in history. And the way his career was unfolding, it just looked about how many of these is he going to get before he decides to walk away because he's bored or he's made enough money. And then the record scratch on his career is the first race of 2020. The injury he had at the Spanish Grand Prix and all of the missteps since then, some of which have been self-inflicted, where it basically paused his career for the best part of 4 years with just multiple injuries and surgeries, and he couldn't be the rider that he needed to be. He's changed teams twice. He's now sneakily the second oldest rider in MotoGP, which is not something you think about with Marc Márquez necessarily. So for him to win this World Championship, which it's been inevitable for so many rounds now that he was going to win this, but to see the raw emotions of a guy who has probably become a lot more human over this second part of his career than perhaps he was in the first part, to see those emotions spill out where he didn't have to hold on to them anymore, it was amazing TV. It was amazing to see a sportsman at the peak of his powers just be so raw and unfiltered. And I think it showed just what it meant to him because of the journey it had taken from 2019 to 2025. Everything he had to go through, he's now back where he was, but this is not one of these linear progressions from 6 to 7.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it does feel like if you didn't know the context and you were colourblind and didn't acknowledge the bike had changed colour, this would look like almost any other MotoGP season for Marc Márquez pre-injury, in that he seemed to essentially bludgeon the field throughout most of the season. 7 Grand Prix wins in a row, which is his most for many years. I think he's only done that once before in his career.
Since 2014, yeah.
There you go. So it feels a lot like almost any of those other seasons. But it does feel like, as you alluded to, a different Marquez this year. Certainly an older Marquez in the way he seems to be approaching the battle, but he's definitely gone about righting the wrong, if you like, of that injury in a way that feels very different. Doesn't feel like simply picking up where he left off.
Not at all. I mean, it's 2 careers of a guy with the same name, as far as I see it. And it was really interesting in the immediate aftermath of Motegi. One of the things he said, I needed to learn how to suffer, which was a really interesting thing to say as soon as you have won this World Championship. It's eluded you for 6 years. He needed to learn what it was to go through what he went through, to maybe appreciate what he was doing in the past a little bit more, and to perhaps close this, redemptive arc on this story that seemed pretty unlikely for a large chunk of the last 5 years. And, it gets you thinking, just major comebacks in any sport. I mean, motorsport, probably the one that comes to mind the most is Niki Lauda with motorsport. But then you look at just sport per se, the 3 that I keep coming back to: Michael Jordan, who chose to walk away, came back and was the best player again after taking 3 years out of his sport. Monica Seles, and we know what happened to her. Her career was stopped and then she came back and won Grand Slams. And Tiger Woods is the other one because there was so long between his major successes because of injury and personal controversy and everything else that went on. It's a remarkable sporting story. It's not just a remarkable MotoGP story. But I thought that the way the sport handled such a momentous moment, the commentary, the presentation, everything about it was, you would have to have a heart of stone to not be moved by what happened in that Japanese Grand Prix at Motegi because of the history that came before it, but also what it means in terms of the sport's significance moving forward. This is one of the absolute all-time greats, coming up with probably a very, very unlikely championship. You don't often get to see those two things together, and that's why it was just such a special moment, I think. And
we were actually talking about this before the podcast, so I'm just going to throw you straight back to a conversation we were having earlier. So you've had practice for it.
Oh, good.
The answer better be good. But we've talked about this, and certainly the coverage talked a lot about this being, as you said, one of the greatest sporting comebacks of all time. Questions like that are always going to be subjective, but certainly it's in that conversation. For everything he's gone through, everything he's dealt with. But Marquez has always obviously been a very special talent, the way he arrived on the scene when some of the all-time greats were still racing, the way he's come back and dominated riders we'd assumed were the next of their era, the next generation. He's made them all look like they've either not arrived yet or the generation too far gone. What makes him so good, and what have you seen in him this year that's made him better than what we've seen before?
It's interesting. He came in as this absolute force of nature as a 20-year-old rookie in 2013, and his main championship rivals were Dani Pedrosa, probably the best rider never to win a MotoGP World Championship, Valentino Rossi, who is the GOAT, and Jorge Lorenzo, who was incredible in his heyday. And he beat all three of them to win the title as a 20-year-old rookie. That was astonishing in and of itself, but it was what he did in those early days with Honda, in that he would save crashes by digging his elbow and his knees into the tarmac and somehow not falling off. He was like a cat, like he just fell on his feet the entire time. There was the aggression in battle. There was he would respect his rivals, but once the visor was down, he was as bloody-minded as they came. And 6 titles in the first 7 years, it was clearly a means to an end. It clearly was a way to win. He's come back this time older, wiser, yes, probably more rounded in life terms now. He's obviously grown up, but that knowing what it means to suffer, I think, has changed his outlook. And it's interesting now in that he's now probably the most cerebral rider on the MotoGP grid. He probably rides smarter than anybody else in that he's the guy is going to have tyre left in the last 5 laps of a race where everyone's shredding their tyres, because he's learned how to ride not beyond his limits and rely on his talent to save him like he did in the past. He now rides within his limits and then deploys that extra bit that he has over everybody else when he needs to now, not just because he can. And it's the evolution of him as a rider, but also as a person. He's become so complete. You're really struggling to pick at weaknesses now. And you think of the old Marquez, despite all the success, he would fall off a hell of a lot. He would crash a lot during practice. It was always his thing. Find the limit, go over it, stay within it. Doesn't fall off very much anymore. He's just become so complete. And there's this aura about what he's done in the past that makes him even more formidable. And if you're going up against someone where you're looking for the weakness, you're struggling to find one with him. And as much as the last 5 years has been hell for him, I actually think it's made him a better rider as far as his ceiling goes over the course of his career.
All right, well, I'm going to ask you to summon, before we move on briefly to other MotoGP stories, in this extended interested versus expert, in which I'm just going to be interested for most of the podcast. Summon all of your predictive powers, pre-crystal ball. Marc Márquez, we've talked about, and as is clear now, the last 5 years of his career has been the story of getting back to this point, of overcoming injury, accepting a lot of that was self-inflicted, some of it at least, and so on. What happens now, though? Now that that box has been checked, does he just go on now winning, I guess, literally for fun, beating everybody else just because he can, or is there something else that happens?
Yeah, that's the big question now, because I think getting back to where he was in 2019 has been the sole focus and the driving force for him for the past 6 seasons, partly because a lot of that absence was self-inflicted. You remember in 2020, he tried to come back after a shoulder operation 5 days for the second race of 2020 at Jerez, and then pulled out. There were 3 subsequent surgeries. He did the best part of a season and a half with a right arm that was rotated 34 degrees out of place. Now, if you're listening to this, rotate your right arm 34 degrees out of place and try and do anything. Pick up your coffee cup, let alone wrestle a MotoGP bike around. Won races during that period, by the way.
Grim.
It's so grim. But it's interesting, this has clearly driven him now for so long. So what is there left to achieve? Is it a number? Is it winning 1 or more MotoGP titles, more than Valentino Rossi? Now they both have 7. Is it 100 Premier Class victories? He doesn't need the money. He certainly doesn't need the adrenaline rush. He's ticked this enormous box. What fires him now? He's still clearly young enough and good enough to do this for as long as he wants to do, but there needs to be an external stimulus for him. And right now, I'm not even sure he would know what that external stimulus is, because this has propelled every decision he's made since 2020, when he made the mistake of trying to come back too early. He now needs to find that impetus. We don't know what that is. It'll be interesting to see him try and understand what that is and then verbalise it as we go forward.
Yeah, I almost think this is now the most interesting part of the chapter, because it's been clear that he's had the ability. He didn't lose in the intervening time period for quite a while now. What happens next now that the goal's been achieved is very interesting. I want to touch on a couple of other stories from the weekend before we move on. If you didn't know anything that had happened in the last year, you would have turned on. If you just only watched last year and come back, Francesco Minaya at the front, dominating everybody, winning like it's easy for him.
Yep.
What happened? Where's this come from?
What happened? The two words that everyone would like the answer to. It's funny because, this is a race that's in our time zone, so you can kind of stumble across this if you're a casual sports fan. Pecco Bagnaia won the sprint and the Grand Prix in Japan last year. He won the sprint and the Grand Prix in Japan this year. So I guess he's just had a pretty smooth last 12 months. It was his 2nd Grand Prix win of the year, and the first one he inherited back at the Circuit of the Americas in April when his teammate Marc Márquez crashed out of the lead. Pecco has been completely lost for much of this season. Ducati's GP25 bike doesn't give him the feeling that he needs on the front of the bike. Pecco's a precision instrument, right? This is the way that he rides. If everything's perfect and you could hold every race in a laboratory, he wins most of the time. He is this generation's Jorge Lorenzo. Marc Márquez is this generation's Casey Stoner. So Marc will ride around the bike that's not quite right, and if the bike's not quite right, Pecco can't ride it. My understanding is they had a 1-day post-race test after Misano 2 weeks previously where he was hopeless. Bagnaia finished out of the points in the sprint and crashed from Nowheresville in the race. It looks like they've taken a lot of the 2024 parts from the bike he won 11 Grand Prix on last year. It's still got the 25 engine in it because that's homologated and you can't change it. It's like a lot of the characteristics of the bodywork of that 24 bike. They've almost created a bit of a Frankenstein's monster here because everything they've tried this year to this point hasn't worked, and he's got increasingly frustrated by it. And it was interesting, his response. He was utterly dominant at Motegi. He led every lap of the sprint. He led every lap of the Grand Prix. No one saw him after the first lap. And after the race, he was asked if he was happy that he was back to his winning ways. And he said, I'm happy, but I'm also angry. And I think he's been beating the drum to Ducati saying, I can't ride what you're giving me. I can't ride what you're giving me. And it's almost like Ducati's thrown their hands up and said, look, all right, you can have bits of last year's bike, the bits that we can give you. And whether that's unlocked something mentally for him or physically, whatever the case, he looked completely unbeatable over the course of the weekend. Now, caveat with this, Marc Márquez is riding thinking for a world championship, right? So Marc was a little bit stiff and quite nervous, actually. It was quite weird to see the way Marc rode over the weekend. Now that, there's nothing at stake as far as the championship goes, wouldn't it be super interesting for these final 5 rounds if we get evidence that A, Bagnaia is back to being Bagnaia, and Marc can just go and race now. Like, there's no championships to think of or anything else. Maybe belatedly we get this really intriguing fight at the front between these two teammates that going into the season was the story we thought we'd see, and we just have not seen it because Marc's been that good and Bagnaia's been that poor.
And finally, Jorge Martin's broken his collarbone. A pretty awful crash in the sprint, wasn't it?
Yep.
And not great for a guy who's already been injured so many times. But as I understand it in MotoGP, he'll be back this week.
He might even take a weekend off. He went back to Barcelona for surgery, broke his right collarbone. Horrendous first corner accident in Motegi. It was one of those ones you hide behind the couch to make sure everyone's okay. His 4th major injury of surely the worst World Championship defence of all time. He will miss Indonesia. don't be surprised if he's in Australia in 2 weeks. MotoGP guys are a little bit different, and there's 3 whole weeks between now and Phillip Island, and well, that's fine for a collarbone. They're all, it's an anti-clockwise track. He'll be fine. But whether he turns up for Australia and Malaysia, strong chance, but no Indonesia this weekend.
Yes, I think that's for the best.
For everyone's sake.
Stay home.
Stay home.
Rest. Goodness sake. If you want more of Matt's thoughts, of course, you can download the Pit Talk podcast later in the week, the MotoGP edition. Yes. Which will be chatting at length, undoubtedly, about the significance of this title win, Japanese Grand Prix, and previewing this weekend's race in Indonesia. But let's move on to Move of the Week, brought to you by Shannon's. All MotoGP this weekend. Fair bit of passing. Obviously, there was passing that paled in significance compared to what happened over the course of the weekend. But what caught your eye?
The thing that caught my eye was the significance of a pass for what it meant, in that the 2020 world champion, Joan Mir, passed Pedro Acosta halfway through that race to finish third. Not really the headline story after Bagnaya's resurgent victory and Marquez winning a historic world championship. For Mir, that's his first podium since the end of 2021 and the first HRC factory Honda podium since 2 years previously, when Marquez finished third at Motegi, funnily enough. This is a team and an organisation that just won races for fun, particularly during the Marquez era. But you think Casey Stoner won world championships there. They had Rossi back in the day, Danny Pedrosa, who I mentioned. Significant for Honda. Significant for Mir, because there's been 68 races since he's been on a podium. And this is a guy who won, the world championship that Marquez didn't win because 2020 when he hurt himself. And he's had so much bad luck and he's hurt himself so many times. He's a different MotoGP rider when he's on something he can believe in. He's all action, super fun to watch. To see him on this historic podium on this historic day, the move that got him there and the fact that he sustained it, he didn't crash for once, which is normally Joan Mir's big problem. So the move and what it represented was the move for me in a race that got a little bit stale because of the other side stories going on it. But you mentioned no Supercars, no F1, so I'm assuming you also have a MotoGP move in mind.
That's correct, yes. I'm going, for many reasons we've already talked about, Bagnaia overtaking, if you will, the track record.
Oh my God.
Fastest lap, just because at that point in the weekend we knew in practice he'd always been fast, but you never know until rubber really hits the road in qualifying and in the race sessions. But it showed that this weekend felt like something we haven't seen for a long time from him. Not even just talking about the glimpses of speed, but the sustainable speed, the confidence, the way he talked about he's now got something he can push on, that he can be confident in. This felt like, I don't want to say it, but it felt like a turning point, not just for results. We shouldn't just expect him to come back and start winning races, whatever, but it just felt like mentally there was a little bit of a change here that we haven't seen at those other races where, it felt like, maybe he'd cracked something here or there. This felt more important than that.
Yep.
And that's my overtake of the week.
No, I agree. In a lot of ways, he's sort of overtaking his own self-doubt in a lot of respect. The fact that he was confident enough to put it all on the line, to my mind, Q2 in MotoGP is one of the most fun things in motorsport, because you've got one lap on one tyre with no fuel in these things, and this is where these guys take every risk imaginable. And for him to obliterate the track record at a really, really hard circuit the way he did, that's the sign that this could be the start of something bigger. So I think it's a good selection.
Yes, I hope so anyway. But look, I'm happy to take the weird overtake for this one.
Absolutely.
The left field overtake, by definition.
That's my territory.
Let's move on now, though, to this weekend's on-track action in Formula One with the Singapore Grand Prix. The sport has left Europe. We're now at those final flyaways. We are in Asia. Don't look at the time of the race, though. It looks very much like we're still in Europe.
Yep.
But that's okay. This is one of the most challenging races on the calendar. It is at night, but it is under lights, which is its own challenge. And if anyone's been to Singapore or that part of the world, the humidity and the heat doesn't really go away just because the sun has gone down. And it is a challenging street track as well. And we'll talk about the physical elements of this in just a moment. But I want to reset the championship picture here. Oscar Piastri still leads from Lando Norris, 25 points. It's 69 points back to Max Verstappen. That's still a lot. We talked about the permutations on last week's podcast after the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. But this race feels like an important one, because we're going to learn something this weekend about the title fight, about where it is. It feels, I don't want to necessarily say delicately poised, but it feels like it's on a precipice maybe we didn't expect. There's no obvious sense of flow at the moment. If Oscar Piastri wins, it'll be a change in form, because he's been pretty well handled by Lando Norris over the last 2 years. If Lando Norris wins, that'll probably feel important to him in getting a bit of the momentum back in the title. If Max Verstappen wins, a track Red Bull Racing hasn't won at in 11 years, that he's never won at, that's going to feel important too, I think.
The word precipice is a really good one here, because it feels that there's significant ramifications for whichever of those three plot lines you just outlined there which one of those becomes the predominant storyline over the course of the weekend? There's so much for all three of these guys to gain, A, in and of themselves, but B, what that does to the other two that are in this title fight. And I use air quotes here because it might not be an actual fight. Tell you what, if Verstappen wins this weekend, then I reckon it's absolutely game on for the three of them. But it's not a tipping point of a weekend because there's so many races left to go, as you well know, and so many late nights and what have you still to come. But this race it's significant in that it is so challenging. It's the biggest. It probably is the biggest test of the Formula One season. Let's be honest. I feel that doing well here is significant at any time. But with this really interestingly poised situation we find ourselves in, which before Monza we never would have been having this conversation, right? So you've had Piastri finally has a DNF. Norris has a chance to punish Piastri in Azerbaijan and doesn't. And from kind of nowhere, and Red Bull's just been chaotic all year, and Christian Horner goes, and you never would have thought it would have ended up like this. And Verstappen's gone and won back-to-back Grand Prix, and it feels believable and sustainable, and we know how good he is. So the word precipice is a really good one because it feels that whichever one of those things comes true that you outlined before is really significant, but what's the knock-on effect for the other two? It's super delicately poised, I think.
Yeah, I almost feel like it's hard to say who's got most at risk here. I think Verstappen probably not, because no one's 100% convinced he's in this fight yet, right? He's in a position where he could pull himself into it, but I think, if he's defeated here, if he's off the podium, for example, I think just points-wise it's going to make it too difficult, even if he does have this great run to the end of the year. So I don't want to say there's too much at stake for him, because I think even he himself probably wouldn't have believed he could be this relatively close to the fight only a couple of races ago. Lando Norris, I'm not totally convinced either, because I think that while he's not going to lose the title this weekend, but a big blow this weekend could be significant. If he loses 10 points, let's say, that'll feel important. But for Piastri, maybe at stake is not the way I should have set this up, but I feel like this is almost a more important race for him because we had that such uncharacteristically poor weekend in Azerbaijan, and it's something we haven't seen from him before, so we're now a little bit in uncharted waters, except for the fact, and you can make this likeness if you like, after Australia is an example. The last important mistake he made, and yes, there's an asterisk on that because the weather arrived and Norris went off as well, but he rebounded by winning in China and being directly on a trajectory back into the title lead. Do we see the same from him this weekend? I think that's an important question. Yeah, and this feels to me like, you mentioned before, this should be much more of a McLaren track than either Monza or Baku were previously. And to my mind, this is almost like an away game for Oscar Piastri in a lot of respects, despite the fact there'll be a million Australians up there because it's so close and the time zone's, very profitable for us. But to my mind, this Norris question is not in isolation at a track where he's been good and McLaren's been good. It's because it comes after Baku, where he didn't punish the rare Piastri mistake, almost unforeseen. We've never seen this from Oscar before. So to my mind, the fact that Norris didn't necessarily capitalise on that, I think it almost puts more pressure on him this weekend to convert at a track where he's won before and has been good in a car that should be good. Anything less than that, those missteps compound a little bit. And so that's the interesting part for me, in that, Piastri's had his wobble. He bounced back so well in China, as you mentioned. But because of what Norris didn't do in Baku, anything less than Norris going out and winning this weekend feels like not so much an opportunity lost, but just not an advantage gained. I know that sounds, I'm sort of speaking in tongues here, but I think you know what I mean here. In that there's much more. Norris needs to have the weekend perhaps he didn't have in Baku. And then if that happens, then we'll shrug our shoulders and go, well, of course, because this goes to the script. But what we've seen in the past two rounds is that nothing's going to the script anymore. And so I have much more confidence in Piastri being able to bounce back and have a good, for him, in Singapore result. If he was to finish second or third, I think that's a perfectly par result for this year. If he was to win Singapore, that's massive for the terms of the championship and the inter-team play within McLaren. But I'm looking at these next two, Singapore and Austin, as if Piastri can... Say Piastri ships 10 points to Norris in these next two races, because they strike me as both being Norris circuits. That puts him in a really good place for these final five after that, because I think they're much more at circuits that will play more to his strength. So it's not a ticking clock on Norris yet, but we're starting to wind the ticking clock up a little bit, aren't we? Yeah, it's true. And I really like the way you put the Norris question here, because it does feel like if he didn't take that opportunity in Azerbaijan, when will he take an opportunity? Well, exactly. That's the question for him now. Right? The points are still... it's achievable. He can still go out and win this through the force of his own performances. Absolutely. It's not out of his hands. But if he doesn't do it, if he didn't do it in Baku, When will that happen? And these two next races are a great example because they are in the brief history of his teammate partnership with Oscar Piastri 2 years, but they have been Norris tracks.
Absolutely,
They've always been at least a step ahead at the next two. Mexico's a little bit more... Mexico as well, but it's a bit more random because they've had such unusual results there, and it's a weird track. But the next two, they're going to be really indicative. And this weekend particularly, considering the challenge of this track, I think will be worth watching. I do want to touch on that challenge of this circuit as well, because it is, again, to revisit that, extremely physically demanding. Only marginally less so since they changed the track slightly, temporarily, I believe, to do some construction work. There's another longish straight there now.
Yes.
You're on a chance to cool down, but it's still pretty punishing. And there are rookies at this venue that will never have been to this track before because it's not a regular on the F2 or the F3 calendar. Yep. You have to have essentially been a wealthy gentleman driver in a Ferrari to have raced in this circuit.
Yes.
Not as a Formula One driver, and none of them fit that bill. Isaac Hadjar, Oliver Behrman, Gabriel Bortoletto and Kimi Antonelli, all completely new to this track.
Yep.
This is a track that drivers often talk about as well as preparing for 4 months before the race.
Yeah.
This is going to be a big test for these drivers as well, some of whom, Antonelli I'm thinking of in particular, need a little bit of momentum to continue this season.
I think we shouldn't underestimate just how brutal the challenge of this place is. Like, if you've spent any time in Singapore, going out in the day, like, you're exhausted 3 minutes after you've been outside, quite frankly. But at night, you're racing at night in, very, very hot car, in fireproof overalls and a helmet and all of the other things. The concentration, the fact that it's at night, you're tricking your body to be on sort of European time zone, despite the fact that you're eating and sleeping and doing all sorts of things at very, very random hours. I don't know if you can necessarily prepare. No preparation is enough for your first Singapore. I think getting through your first Singapore, I remember Daniel Ricciardo's first Singapore. He thought he was ready for it. I think he lost 2.5 kilos during that race and was absolutely shattered to the point where he was just in the fetal position for about 2 days afterwards. And he thought he was prepared at the time. And, subsequent years, he was clearly prepared and he had better conditioning. But until you've experienced it, and you look at someone like Antonelli, I mean, this is such a challenge. There's nowhere growing up as a European driver you can be remotely ready for this sort of thing.
And he's a teenager.
And he's a kid. I wasn't doing that when I was 18. There's no chance. But the other part about this as well is that you don't get Malaysia anymore on the calendar. It's almost like a bit of a soft landing as well. Like, well, Singapore will be worse than this, but if you can get through Malaysia, you can get through Singapore. We don't have Malaysia on the calendar anymore. So it is such an outlier, a one of one now. There's nowhere like this place. And it's a factor in that last stint of the race where everyone's just hanging on at this point. And it's hot and you might be stuck in a DRS train somewhere. The concentration element is another element to this particular race that makes it super intriguing because it's grueling. And that's not a word we use with Formula One these days very often.
No, because it is, fundamentally, it's the challenge of even a fit athlete. An athlete who obviously, after 20 odd races a year, is pretty good at being in a racing car and going fast. But this takes it to another level. If you want to imagine what the challenge is like without the preparation, go back a couple of years ago to the Qatar Grand Prix. I think it was 2023, wasn't it? When F1 returned to that track, it was at a slightly unusual time of year compared to where we have it. It was brutally humid. The conditions were really difficult. And it was a night race still, so there was no sun element, no desert sun element. We had, Logan Sargent at the time withdrew because he fainted from heat stroke in the car, essentially. I think Lance Stroll, similar as well, passed out in the garage. Esteban Ocon was sick in his helmet, I think.
Well, and the other factor there was because there was some issues with the Pirelli rubber, you remember?
Yes,
so there were mandatory pit stops in that race, which meant everyone had to two-stop, which meant everyone got to push flat out for 3 stints in a race that was much earlier in the year, and no one was prepared for it. It was a war zone after that race. They were just dropping like flies. And that was just such a one-off that they've never had the race at the same time of year again, and they've taken harder tyre compounds. We'll never see a repeat of that. But Singapore is this challenge annually. Every single year it comes up, and it's going to bite someone. And you mentioned those rookies. As much as other drivers will tell them, and as much as they've been preparing for months, as you've said, there's going to be some pretty sore and sorry people by the end of Sunday night, because unless you've done it, you don't know what it's like.
I'll be grateful that there's a weekend off after this race. I think
absolutely.
Everyone will be really, anyone who's been in the car will think that. Before we wrap up, let's go to the crystal ball, brought to you by Complete Home Filtration. A couple of races on this week, not only Singapore, but the Indonesian Motorcycle Grand Prix as well. Where are you taking us?
I think I'm going to stick with the 2-wheel theme because I suspect you're going to go with a 4-wheel one. And I think we're going to see our first proper head-to-head between Pecco Bagnaia and Marc Márquez, because it's the earliest a World Championship has ever been decided. 5 races before the end of the season. So the way I'm seeing these 5 races is everyone could just put the queue in the rack, but there's too much at stake here for someone like Bagnaia and trying to prove that Motegi wasn't a flash in the pan. Marquez now doesn't have to think about the World Championship. To my mind, 2026 might be starting this weekend, and that there's so much in terms of momentum and narrative and storyline. We might get 5 pretty interesting races before the end of the season now, because of what it means for next year. We've got a lot of riders staying in the same positions for next year before the 2027 rule reset, and there's going to be people scattering everywhere. To me, this is the beginning of the 2026 pre-season, and the way these last 5 rounds might play out. We might get our first Bagnaia Marc Márquez duel as teammates, which it's round 18 and we haven't had one. So I think it's not before time. I would love to see it at a track that's pretty peculiar. It's a track where Marc Márquez has never scored a point before.
Wow, not even a point.
Not even a point, because he's beaten himself up with some horrendous crashes. 2022, he had one of the biggest accidents of his career there. So he's got a score to settle with that place. But yeah, is this Bagnaia momentum real? I'd like to see it played out on Sunday. But you're clearly going to be going F1 Singapore here, and I don't know whether it involves a giant lizard crossing the track or anything else. But
that's a given.
That's mandatory.
It has to happen, yes.
But I suspect it won't be wildlife, it'll be something else.
No, I'm going straight for Max Verstappen, who arrives here, we should say, with 3 wins from the last 4 races. Won a GT3 race at the Nürburgring at the weekend, just because he had the time to go and have a crack.
Nürburgring would be good preparation for Singapore weather, surely.
Yes. Well, I mean, the concentration for, a 20-kilometre lap at the Nordschleife, so there's some element there.
True.
I think he's going to win. I think he's going to win the Singapore Grand Prix for the first time in his career, which in itself is a remarkable statistic. Perhaps similar to Marquez never scoring a point in Indonesia. And I just think the consequences of that victory at a track that this car shouldn't perform well at. It's the only race that Red Bull didn't win in that year. They won everything.
Every other race,
2023, a couple of years ago, it was a Ferrari win then. I don't think that's going to happen.
No.
Then again, the first time we don't predict a Ferrari win, probably the weekend's going to happen. I think it's going to be Max. I think that's going to be throw the title cat amongst the pigeons. Wow. We're going to have a lot to talk about.
And we've said this before, that a lot of people think that journos have a certain bias towards certain drivers of nationalities or whatever. We're cheering the narrative here. I will be cheering that narrative very, very hard, because in terms of what that sets up for the remainder of the season, bring it on, I say.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting. But that's all the time we have for Pit Talk today. You can subscribe to Pit Talk wherever you get your favourite podcasts, and you can leave us a rating and a review as well. This weekend, it is the Indonesian Motorcycle Grand Prix with lights out at 6 p.m. on Sunday, followed by the Singapore Formula 1 Grand Prix at 11 p.m. And yes, that is daylight saving time.
Yes.
Just remember that.
Set your clocks.
Yes, you can keep up to date, consult your local guides with the latest F1, Moto GP and Supercars news at foxsports.com.au. From Matt Clayton and me, Michael Ominato, thanks very much for your company, and we'll catch you next week.